All right, hello everybody and welcome. My name is Steven Kreutzfeldt and I'm going to be your host for today's consulting webinar, which is going to be a Laserfiche build-along covering compliance review. If this is your first time attending one of our build-alongs, it's meant to be an interactive experience. It's designed to guide the viewer through the creation and deployment of a common business process. If at any time you have questions, please post those into the floating questions box or the chat box. I will be taking some time at the end of the webinar to go over and answer as many of those as I can. To get the most out of this today, make sure you're taking good notes. I recommend also taking screenshots where possible. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Please complete the survey afterwards, and also note that this will be recorded, and we typically have it up and available on our YouTube channel the following week. If you are not already following or subscribed to the CDI YouTube channel, I encourage you to do that today. That way you can get notifications when new content is added. So today's process is going to be around compliance review. The intended audience for this webinar is going to be financial services or anyone who has a compliance business process in their organization. And it will be geared toward experienced forms users. I would even go as far as to say advanced forms users. If you are not familiar with the forms designer in Laserfiche, this might not be the best place to start. So today you're going to need access to the Laserfiche repository, Laserfiche forms, as well as workflow. Today's process is going to be significantly more, I don't want to say complicated, complex. We're going to be really showing how you can use forms to jump out, invoke workflows, run those workflows, and then return back to forms. And all of that's going to be working to move files around in your repository as well. So we're kind of getting more towards that advanced level. I'm going to start by going through and showing you a demonstration of, this is an example process of a compliance review. Yours might look a little bit different, but I at least needed to dip my toes in the water and show you a slight example, knowing that it can be adjusted to fit your organization's process. We'll then go through and talk about the setup and what you're going to need in place in order to get this to run. And then we'll go through and actually build the whole thing out. Be forewarned, when we actually get into the build along, I'm going to be moving a little bit quick just to try and keep this under an hour. I want to make sure we get through the whole thing, and it is relatively complex. I'm really leaning on the fact that this is going to be recorded and available on YouTube for individuals to stop, rewind, fast forward, etc. So with that being said, here's a quick snapshot of what we're going to be building. In this compliance review process, we're going to start by having a user submit a form that needs to go through a compliance review. It's going to be then saved to Laserfiche, so the physical file or document itself that's being reviewed is actually going to reside in Laserfiche for the duration of this. We're going to generate a URL, and the reason I'm going to do this is I've been using more and more of this process or this concept where we can display a file from Laserfiche in an iframe in form. So that way you can actually view the document rather than clicking on it and downloading it and then messing with it. This is one where you can actually see and access the file within Laserfiche from an iframe. So once that's generated, it'll allow the compliance review person to go and scroll down and browse through and review the form in real time within Laserfiche. They could even mark it up, add metadata and things like that as well. They can then make the decision if it's in good order or not in good order. And then if it's in good order, we can send out an email back to the person who submitted it, say, looks good, go ahead, or not in good order where it can be moved. They'll get an email saying, here's the comments, this is what needs to be fixed. And then it'll also send them a hyperlink so they can go back and easily log back into the form and submit the new one for that process. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. As I mentioned, here's our process again, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit play right from the form designer itself. I'm keeping it pretty light here. I'm not adding a lot of information. If you've used forms in the past, you know that you can fill out additional information fields and have that pass over as metadata. But today, the only ones I'm really going to be using are things like the email. I'm capturing my name automatically, so whoever is submitting it is just auto-populating here. And then whatever you want to actually name the file. So I set it up here so that way you can rename the file upon import, so you can easily find it that way. We're just going to call it AMA. We'll use Dwight Schrute today. We'll grab the file that we want to submit for review. You can limit the types of files that can be submitted. If you only want to include image files like TIFFs or JPEGs or BMPs, you can. In this case, I have it allowing for electronic files as well, like PDFs or Word docs. The only difference between these two is that when you're reviewing them in the iframe, which I'll show you in a moment, if it's an image file, they'll be able to easily mark it up using the annotations in Laserfiche, like redact, highlight, sticky notes, stamps, etc. Whereas if it's a electronic file, you'll likely have to download it locally if you want to make changes to the physical file itself, but it's not going to restrict you from viewing it or adding comments. Another disclaimer here, I am going to be working out of the Laserfiche cloud today, so if parts of the user interface seem a little different from what you're used to, that's why. But the concepts all are available in Laserfiche forms on-premise as well, so I'm not going to be using anything that isn't available to you already. Now in this case, I have an actual physical task that was assigned to me in the Laserfiche cloud. This could just as easily be an email that's sent out to a user. Or if you're getting notifications, this would show up in your forms inbox. So we can see here that it renamed the file AMA Dwight Schrute, so that's how it's showing up. And then this is the iframe I'm talking about. This is actually Laserfiche forms. This is a forms task, and I'm able to view the document as it resides in Laserfiche and just scroll through it, and it's going to display all the different pages. We have the option for IGO or NIGO, and then we can make any comments. So let's say that we're missing a signature. Maybe I want to sign my name on it or something also. We can say, sorry, not in good order. This isn't going to work. So I'm going to go back to my home page here for a second. I want to show you the email that came in for that. So you'll see here that I got an email and it actually downloaded and attached the document as sort of a reminder, like here's what's not in good order. This isn't what's going to work. It populated my name also. That's because I captured that on the form, showing that it's not in good order. Please review the comments and make changes as needed. Here's the comments. It's missing a signature. It also has this hyperlink right here. So if I actually follow that link, it's going to take me right back to the submission. I will note that in order to make this possible and have the hyperlink work outside of your organization, you will have to have Forms Portal. If that's something you're interested in, is making your forms available to the public, please talk to us at Cities Digital, and we can get you some quotes and talk about how that whole process works. In this case, I'm going to say that I went ahead and revised that, made sure I got my signature, sent it out via DocuSign. It came back, and now it's ready to go. So we'll say AMA Dwight Schrute with signature. We can upload the new copy here. I'll also note that what I'm doing here is submitting additional copies, so additional files. We can always make sure that they're seen as either attachments or they have some sort of relationship, linking them back to one another to show that this is the new version. We also support version tracking if you want to overwrite or rather save as a new file on top of the same document as a new version. That is another option as well. I'm not going to be, I didn't put that in this process, but I want you all to know that that is an option that is available. So we have the new compliance review. It's been sent back to me. So compliance officers can go in, give it a second to load, say, oh yeah, looks like everything's filled out just fine. Signature is there. You just say it looks good, and it's in good order. Now in the repository, what's actually happening in the back end here, and this will be kind of part of our setup, I have a just compliance review root folder. I have all my documents coming into incoming, and that's going to be a folder that my workflows are going to be monitoring to try and find the document and then move it wherever it needs to go. If it's assigning a task, once it's assigned to a task, the file is physically being moved to the under review. So if there are any files that are actually in transit or under review, we'll be able to see where those are at. And then I have my in good order and my not in good order here. So from a setup standpoint, what we'll need to do is, first of all, make sure that you have a folder location where you want those to come in at. That's first and foremost. I always talk about setting up your infrastructure first. If you want to include metadata, like who reviewed it, when it was reviewed, a lot of that may be captured on the file itself, just in the details. But if you want to add even additional information to that, you'll want to be able to capture that as metadata. So make sure your templates are set up, make sure that your fields are set up, make sure that you have everything in place there. Similarly, security. Always a big ask there. You want to make sure that nobody's accessing these files that isn't supposed to. When it's under compliance review, if you want to take it offline, a good way to lock it down would be to go to that compliance review under review folder. If we just right click and show security, we can make sure that our only specific users have access to that. I recommend assigning access via group whenever possible, not individual users. Of course, depending on the size of your organization, it might make sense to just do it user by user. Now, as far as actually building the form, let's go ahead and go to our Laserfiche Forms Designer. If you're accessing this from an on-prem solution, you'll go to your Forms Designer the same way that you would normally. It's either going to be installed on a web server or a Laserfiche server. If you've never seen this before, again, I would recommend going through some earlier training courses and also talk to your Laserfiche administrator about how to get access to that. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a new one here, and I'm just going to use a blank process, and we're going to call it Webinar Compliance and create. So it's taking me to the canvas here. There are two sides of every forms process. There is the process itself, where you actually start dragging and dropping what those events are going to look like. And then there's also the forms themselves. My recommendation and best practice in my opinion, build your forms first. Because you're going to want to be able to say which version of the form is going to be, it's asking me to save first, which version of the form is going to be routed where and which version of the form we're saving. Another thing that I think helps a lot is to go ahead and whiteboard this out. Have the conversation with the other members of your team about who's going to be submitting these, who they're going to go to next. If they're IGO, then what? If they're NIGO, where do they go? Then what happens? Get the whole thing planned out first. That way you can build from the map that you've already created. You also need to know what the form is going to look like at each level. All right, so create a new form here. I like to number them. We're just going to call this compliance submission. One thing I like to do also, I think the forms look nicer when the labels are on the top. So if you go up to your settings option here on the right, you can say align at the top. It's just a personal preference. It doesn't actually make any difference about how the form is assigned or anything like that. See if we can spell that correctly. So the submission form is going to have certain information on it that you want to capture and then be able to pass over to whoever is reviewing that form. But whoever is reviewing it, if we want them to be able to see it in an iframe like that, it'll obviously have to have a different layout than the original. So that's why we're going to be creating two different forms. Now the first one here, we're going to go ahead and just create a single line. I'm going to drag and drop that on here, and that's going to be to capture my name. And the way that I automatically captured whoever filled it out is by scrolling down to default value and using my token selector. There are a certain number of tokens that are available just automatically from any process. If you start opening these up, you can see what we can capture. So start date, start time, instance ID is usually just a string of letters and numbers, which is great if you want to identify this instance as a whole. But typically it's not very valuable to actually just pass over because no one will really know what it means or what it looks like. But in this case, we have current user email, current username, and current user username. And so this is whoever they're actually logged in to forms as. So it's likely going to be a Laserfiche username, Laserfiche associated password, and things like that. If you are using Windows AD accounts and they're using those Windows accounts to access forms, it'll be captured from that information. The other thing you can do here then is say read only, and then there you have it. It's going to automatically capture whoever is filling out the form. Next thing I like to do is grab the email address, because that's who the automated emails are going to go to say, yes, your form has been found in good order or not in good order. We'll make that required. By the way, variable is very important because that's how you're going to actually point back to which field information you're passing over as either metadata or using in your workflows and referencing in your workflows. If you don't put in a variable, it'll assign one, usually named or based off of whatever the field label is, which is nice. But if you want to add your own variable to keep track of things, you can. So it's going to come in as email. That's probably what the variable would be. But in this case, I want to maybe say it's submitter email, just differentiate. And then we need a place to name the document itself. That'll probably just be a single line as well. One of the other reasons why I choose to add a file name option and not just go with whatever the file is already named is that in my workflows, I need to be able to find that. And it's the easiest way is to find it just based on the name. And if you're passing over the document name verbatim, like if it's renaming it and then also look for the same thing, you can recycle that variable and make the process of identifying or finding the file that you're going to be moving around much easier and much more consistent. And lastly, we need a file upload option. And this is where you can restrict the extensions you want to allow. Again, if you want to only allow TIFF or BMPs, JPEGs, things like that, this is where you would add that. We'll make that one required too. You know what, let's make file name required. Let's make them all required. Making them required means that you will not be able to submit without this information, if that wasn't clear. And just because I think it looks a lot nicer and it shows a lot nicer, I'm going to go ahead and add a theme to this as well. So if we go over to our theme, I have one that's saved, and that's going to put our signature on it. Just change the colors around, liven up the buttons, things like that. Only because the black and white bothers me. That's why we're doing that today. You don't have to, but I think it's actually the most fun part of this is kind of colorizing it and giving it some character. All right, so there are actually a couple of other fields that you didn't see on that form that we're still using, and so I'm going to create a section and call it hidden fields. So down here we have section, so I'm going to drag that out. I'm going to literally label it hidden fields. And this is so I can capture information on the background that doesn't necessarily need to be shown to the end user. It's not relevant to them, but it is going to be critical to the process itself. One of these is going to be URL, and I always give it a variable of capital URL because I reuse a lot of my HTML and code and things like that. And the other one is going to be the document ID. That's the ID that's assigned by Laserfiche to the file when it's saved to the Laserfiche repository. So it's that unique identifier that it will allow us to find that document every time without fail. And then we go to our field rules. Oh, yep, save. ABS, always be saving. With our field rules, we can hide and show based on specific rules. And so what we want to do is go ahead and say hide hidden fields, that whole section, always, and save. So if you want to see what it looks like, we can go to our preview. That'll pop it open, and we can't see any of that, but we've got our email, file names, and upload are all consistent here. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is create another form. If you want to, you can use the copy option right here, but this one's going to be different enough that I'm actually just going to create a new form here. This one's going to be to Compliance, yep, compliance review, exactly the same as the other one. You got it. I like the classic one. This is just something that's relatively new with Laserfiche. They've given you a couple of different options on how to create these forms and build them out. If you want to use a forms designer or the classic forms designer. Classic is how I learned. It's what I'm used to, but by all means, if you have time, feel free to play around with the the other use form designer. Maybe let us know what the differences are or why you think one's better than the other. You know how if you do something long enough, you kind of get set in your ways. I'm there. I'm set in my ways. Wow. Okay, done. And align top. All right. So on this one, we're going to start by bringing some of our variables over from the other one. This is really important. This wasn't totally clear to me when I first came on board about 3 years ago, started learning Laserfiche forms. If you want to make sure you're passing the information from one form to the next, you need to use the same variables, meaning you don't bring over the fields from here. You go to the variables that are already created, and you bring them over from there. And actually, we really only need those. In fact, we may only need the URL. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Sorry. Bear with me here. The URL is going to contain basically everything that we need at this point. So bring over the URL from the variables that you already created. And then the only other field we need is actually going to be a custom HTML field. Now don't leave, don't leave. I'm just waiting for people to drop off like, oh, there's coding. Oh my gosh. I'm not a programmer. Anyone who's sat on these before knows I'm not a programmer. What I am is sneaky, and I've got HTML and CSS and JavaScript that I reuse over and over and over again that does what I need it to, so I can just copy and paste. I've got a whole big long OneNote filled with just code that I copy and paste. And actually, if you reach out to CDI and say, hey, I was on a webinar and Steven said that there's a Word doc with a bunch of HTML and JavaScript and SQL things like that. Can I get a copy of that? Absolutely. I don't know how helpful it's going to be to you or not, but I've got it available and I'm more than happy to share it. So feel free to request that. You can do that at consulting@citiesdigital.com. Say, share with me Steven's code list. And so the one that we're using today, and you can pause this, we're just going to make sure that we're HTML. Don't do the visual. Make sure you're using the actual HTML tab. Copy all that and just paste over it, and you're already going to see it pop open as an iframe, but that's what it looks like. And the source is what actually is going to be displayed. So all this is doing is basically opening up a window and then navigating to a website and then displaying the website inside this window. Technology is simple. One thing that it'll only work if you have access to Laserfiche though, and you know how to get to your web client. We'll go through that in a second. But if they aren't logged into Laserfiche, it's going to take them to like a Laserfiche login screen, or it's just going to say the site can't be reached because you're not already on the network. So there's a couple of ins and outs to be aware of, but this is how I accomplished that viewing of the document. Everybody got the screenshots? Good. So for example, if we just go, yes, always be saving. So if we go ahead in here and preview it, you'll see that we'll see that there's really nothing in there because we haven't populated that URL yet. What we're going to do is use a workflow to generate that and pass it over here, and then it's going to then use whatever's in this as the address that of the website it's going to show up here, which is your Laserfiche web client. Because already I feel uncomfortable viewing such a boring form, we're going to go ahead and put a theme on it. There's got to be some undiagnosed like ADHD or something here that's going on, because that absolutely rubs me the wrong way. All right, so field rules, we're going to go ahead and make sure we add another rule to say that we want to hide the URL always. Just keep it nice and clean and saved. Now, if you wanted to display who submitted it and the user and all that, all you would need to do is add that information by going to the variables and just dragging and dropping, say submitter email. But you actually won't need it because it's still stored in the process, and it's going to know who that is. But we can include it. If you want, you can even go in here, make it read only, done, and save. So those are the two forms we need. Now that we have our forms, we can start building out our process. And if you've whiteboarded this already and you have a pretty good idea of what each step needs to look like, this becomes a very simple task. Now I'm going to reference my map that I used earlier. So we submit the form. It then saves to Laserfiche. You can double click on these, or you can just use the details flag out here and bring it in so you can actually configure this. Give it a unique identifier, something that will tell anyone who comes in after you exactly what this is doing. It's saving the submitted form to Laserfiche. That's what it's doing. You can give a description also. I always like to allow the process to save before continuing. Up to you if you want to generate Laserfiche pages or not. I say, sure, why not? We'll pick a repository profile. This should be, if you're using this not in the cloud, some people have a forms username and password that's specific to it's kind of a service account. I have seen people use workflow. I advise against that when possible, only because we have subsequent workflows that are being run. And if a document is saved by workflow, it may not cause your workflows to run, because you're usually saying don't run this workflow if it's started by your workflow user. So I would say either use a unique forms service account or use admin, so that way you know that it's going to get there. And we're going to save the form with current process data, and we want it to be the submission, although I'm not interested in saving a PDF or TIFF version of the form that's submitted. That information is being captured already. I don't need it in a physical file. What I do need is to go to the File Upload tab, and I need to tell it what to do with our file upload. So the attachment name, we're actually going to say, no, don't call it the attachment name. Call it whatever you took out of the file name field. So when they're filling out the file name field, that's where you put the document name. That's how it's renaming it. And we're going to save it to a different location, and that's going to be, we'll use our ellipses down here to select our path. And remember, what I'm doing is sending it to compliance review incoming. That's where I'm going to look for my document. Now, if you want, this is where you can go to configure fields, and you can assign a template to the attachment. So this is where you can add your metadata. So if I don't think I was using it before, but at least want to point it out. So if it's a client file, you can say client name could be, the name of whoever did this. Category could be what have you. Keywords, account rep, et cetera, So we could just add these using the token. Again, I'm not interested in doing that right now, so we'll just leave it here. I'm just going to save for fun. And I think that's all we need on this. I might go back here and just give this the same path, so that way it has something in it, so it's not empty. Sometimes it gets angry and yells. If you're curious if your workflow is good or not, or sorry, your business process is good or not, you can always hit this check mark and it'll tell you what errors. So in this case, it's saying no starting form is selected. That's right, I forgot to say which form started it. So we'll go ahead and select the big angry red box. Submit form for review. And we'll choose our form, say it's going to be the compliance submission. Compatibility mode means if you're accessing this from a tablet, smartphone, something like that, do you want it to be available for those? Sure. You can allow users to save the form for incomplete for later. Pretty short form though, so probably not necessary. And we'll go ahead and save. We check it again. Validation successful, no errors were found here. So we've submitted our form and it's saved to Laserfiche. The next thing we need to do is create the iframe before we send it to our user for review. So I'm just going to put a workflow service task placeholder in that. If you've never used this before, the workflow service task is saying run a workflow. Now with that one, this is why we're recording. We'll probably have to go through it a couple times. It's a bit in depth. It's also going to look a little bit differently in the cloud than it is on premise, but all the processes, the concepts are the same. So we'll do that placeholder, and then it's going to get routed to our user. Let's go ahead and configure our user really quick, because that one will be easy. User task, compliance review. So this can be assigned to a team. If you have teams created in Laserfiche Forms, it can be a team based on a variable, but you'll need to configure what those variables will be. Or in this case, I'm just going to have it be a specific user. If you want to test a forms process, the best way to do that is to just say send to initiator. Process initiator means it's going to route to whoever submitted the form. So that's me. Or I can have it route to myself over and over and over again if I want to do that also. But I like initiator because that means anybody else that submits it can also go through and test. Okay. Do we want to email users when this task is assigned? You can. I'm not really capturing an email for myself on this though. It'd have to go to a different email. So we'll go ahead and say no. You can add due dates, you can add priorities, high, medium, etc. Those will be displayed in your inbox as such, and so it'll filter them based on those. Really important, you want to know which form you're doing. In this case, it's going to be the compliance review form, the one that has an iframe. You can select which buttons display at the bottom. I didn't add those buttons with code or anything like that. I just simply renamed these. So approve could be in good order, and reject could actually be not in good order. And so it'll rename those. And then we need to have a decision tree. So I'm just going to call this one NIGO or IGO. And we're going to have it go one of two routes. So we can drag that over, connect it. I'm using an exclusive gateway. That's important because it can only go down one path, either IGO or NIGO. If you use an inclusive gateway, it can go down multiple, but not necessarily all, or it could go down to all, I guess. But a parallel gateway will send it down all paths regardless. Just no matter what, it's going to go down all paths. There are use cases for that. If you go back and view some of my other videos, I'll talk about the use case and how to have inclusive and exclusive gateways, and then also exit ways as well to make sure that they merge. So there's videos out there about that. Also, very important thing to note, a forms process will not be found to be complete unless it has a beginning and an end and it's connected to all of them. So if I were to just delete the end event and drop it off the service task, it'll basically say, I can't publish this, it's invalid. Sorry, we don't like it. So make sure that you have end events on all these exits. I'm just going to rename these really quick. We don't actually have these workflows created yet, so we can't tell it which workflow we want to run. But what we can do is go to the properties here on the path itself. So we're opening up this path. I don't know why it named it with my email. We're going to call this one IGO. If you click in the condition, it'll pop open this window. And what you can say is that the last user action equals IGO. And then make sure you hit insert and it'll populate that language for you down here. And we're going to do a similar thing on the branch right above between the exclusive gateway and NIGO. We're going to give it a label. And we're going to click on the condition and say that the last user action equals NIGO insert and save. So what that's saying is that compliance review is, in order to move the form forward, either has to hit IGO or NIGO. Got to select one of those buttons. If he or she hits the IGO button, it's going to go down this path because of this condition. If they hit NIGO, it's going to go down this path. Let's send this. And so now the only thing left is for us to create our workflows. So I'm going to save this. If I was to hit check, it's going to get angry about all of these. Oh, also, make sure you label one of these as the default. It gets mad about those two. All right, so let's go ahead and pop over to workflow. Again, I know I'm going pretty quick here, but we've still got a little bit to go through. All right, so webinar compliance URL, give it a name. If you are using workflow on-premise, not in the cloud, the first activity that you're going to want to have here is called retrieve business process variables. I don't have it here because I'm using it in the cloud, but that is going to be where you will configure this and go through and tell it which variables you want to grab from which form or which forms process, which is your compliance forms process. You'll also need to make sure that you're connected to the workflow server and you have everything set up on this side. However, since we're using the cloud, what we need to do is set up our input parameters and tell it that it's allowed to be started by other processes. So if we view parameters, I'm going to say that we need an input of the document name, or the file name rather. Let's say file name, it's a little shorter. And we need to be able to add outputs, i.e. pass information from the workflow back to forms, like the URL and the doc ID, unique identifier. Actually, the more I'm thinking about this, do you mind if I go back here quick? On your compliance review, I don't think this is the right one. We're going to need to make sure that we include that document ID. That's going to have to be passed over. But I'll do that here in a second. Okay, so we have our input, file name, and we have our output, URL, and doc ID. So what we're going to need to do is first find our entry. Now to find the entry, you can either use the search activity for search repository and then generate that to make sure it's looking for the document name. I found that it's easiest here to say find it at, and we know our path, so I'm going to say look inside compliance review, look inside incoming, and then if we select our token picker here and go to token dialog, we can say add one more path and tell it to look for our file name, which is the input parameter or the retrieved business process variable. And so that should find it. Best practice to also give it detailed labels for each one of our workflow processes as well. So find submitted document. All right, so if we find the submitted document, then we want to move it to a review process to show that it's out of there and under review. So we can say move entry. In this case, I'm going to make sure that move is selected. We want the destination to be a specific folder. So we'll go down into our compliance review, into under review, and OK. Very important here, which entry do we want to move? The one that we found. That's going to be the output entry of the document we found. So move to under review. And then the next thing we're going to do is actually create a new token. And so if we type in tokens, we have this option for assign token values. So assign token values allows you to create new tokens to be used. So things like finding a document, that's going to grab the ID and the name, and you've got tokens to work with. You can do it with dates. But what we're looking to do here is to create a hyperlink, a web URL. So I'm going to modify, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to actually create a new token called, you know what, going back and forth here. In the Laserfiche cloud, this is where you can select your output parameters, so what we're passing on. So the URL is actually going to be an output parameter. So even though it's counterintuitive because we're creating it and simultaneously modifying it, it's actually under modify, output parameters, URL. And the new value is going to be, and this is where you might have to get some help from either IT or just simply go out and log into your Laserfiche account on the web client and just grab the whole path. The last piece here is the ID. So that's a physical document that it's going to display and look at. So in this case, we know that it found the document earlier. So find submitted document, output entry ID, that'll give us a unique identifier of our document. So Laserfiche URL, actually, let me see if I can show you what that would look like. I'm gonna grab this again. If we were to open up a new browser window here and type that in, this is what it should look like. It should just pop up and display your Laserfiche web client. So you'll notice it took me straight to the repository. I didn't give it an ID, so it took me to ID number 1, which is the repository as a whole. So if you can use that, like copy and paste it into a browser window, and it takes you to your repository, that's how you know that you did it correctly. And then you'll just put in your ID for the one that's found. So that's our URL. And then we also want to modify our output parameter for our doc ID. And the new one is going to be our find submitted document output entry ID. And okay. And that's all there is to it. So you can then publish it. So 3 steps with a little bit of configuration, so as long as you have the knowledge. So if we go back to our business process, I'm going to use Control to open up a second window so that way I have both of them opened. Webinar compliance, that's what we're working on. So now what I can do is go to my generate URL, open up my details, and I can select my webinar compliance URL. Important to label it as wait for invoked workflow to finish running. And then we can say which input parameters we want by selecting that, checking it, and telling that the input, I don't know why my email is showing up in everything right now. It's upsetting. And when I deleted that, it deleted the whole thing. Weird. Okay. Let's try this again. Select workflow. Select our workflow. That's why it's also important to say it can be started by other processes. Check wait for invoked workflow to finish running. Add input parameters. Yes. File name. File name is going to be, we'll select our token right here. It's going to be file name. So that's how it knows where to find it. And then our output values is going to be doc ID and URL. So we'll update that. Our doc ID is going to be, it's going to bring in from the workflow doc ID and use that to populate the field for doc ID and bring in the URL to populate the field URL. I hope that makes sense. And because we're populating that, that means that I'm also going to need to go back to my form compliance review and make sure I'm including my doc ID. And we'll save. We go to my field rules. I'm going to say, I also want you to hide document ID as well, just to keep it nice and clean. Okay, so now that you've seen kind of the basics of invoking a workflow and running it and then passing that through, we can do it for our other ones as well. So we'll do NIGO first. If we go back to our workflow designers, I'm going to add a new tab. I'm going to add a new workflow. I'm going to call this one webinar not in good order, and create. So this one's going to be pretty similar. First thing that we're going to want to do is say, before we even add any of these, we want to say allow it to be started by other processes, and we add our parameters. Our input parameters are going to be the file name, the doc ID, email, submitter name, and comments. And there are going to be no output parameters because we're ending our business process after this step, right? So with that coming in, what we can then do is say, first of all, locate the entry. And because we have a document ID from the one that we found in our first workflow, we can say, find the entry with the document ID, the unique identifier, coming from our business process, so doc ID. So find a document ID with doc ID. When they find it, we're going to want to move that entry that it finds the output entry to, and then where do you want to send it? It could be to a retrieve business process variable of the client's name and account number, and then to a subfolder called not in good order. In this case, though, mine are pretty basic, pretty easy. We're just going to send it straight to a NIGO folder. And then we want to make sure we email our user, our submitter, to let them know, sorry, this isn't in good order. Now, the way to configure this, let's just kind of start from the top. Give it a unique name and description. We're going to send it to our input parameter or our retrieve business process variable of email. And you can CC yourself on it if you wanted to. Give it a subject, give it priority, and then we can start to configure the body of our email as well. Hello, and then we have our find entry. It's not find entry, but rather our input parameter of submitter name. So that's how we can make it unique to them. Then shift enter for a new, your submission is not in good order. Please see comments below. And then the comments are going to be also an input parameter, comments. The way that I passed over the way to submit the form, that's actually, if we go back to our business process, if you look at the details here, if you have a public process, you can actually get it from here and say that the link to this, so the way to quickly directly open up this website or this form is by following this. So in this case, it's app.laserfiche.com/forms, and then that. If you hit share, it'll give you an opportunity to just copy that. So if we go back to our process, then you can say resubmit here, and it'll take you directly to it. If you want to include a copy of the form, then what you would need to do is include a download activity. This will only work if it's an electronic document. It won't work with pages, but if you have a PDF that you want to include as an attachment on the email, you can say download electronic document, other entry, the one that it found, and then add that as an attachment. So if we go in here, we can say attach, and then up here we can say the result file of the download electronic document, and okay. And that's all there is to that. So find entry, move it, send the email with the attachment. So then if we go back to our business process, we can say that IGO selected workflow is going to be webinar NIGO You can wait for it to end, but it doesn't make as much of a difference now because we're ending the business process right after it. And publish and save. Because we are running short on time, I'm going to basically tell you that the IGO one is going to be exactly the same. The only difference is it's going to move it to the IGO location, and the email is going to say it is in good order, so there's no next steps or anything like that. This one's important because it's actually going to send them back, revert them back to this process. So to review, what we're doing is we're having someone either inside the organization or outside the organization, if you have Forms Portal, submitting a document that needs to be reviewed by compliance. It's saving that to Laserfiche, where workflow is going to take it and put it into a queue, basically saying it's reserved, it needs to be reviewed. It can then be assigned to a group, round robin, or to a specific user. They're either going to find it in good order or not in good order, in which case either they will be able to send this out. An email will go out letting them know here's what's working or here's what's not working, or if it's IGO, letting them know that it's up to date. I guess the last thing that I'll do here is make sure that we set up our input variables on the NIGO. Because as you know, we're capturing the comments on a pre-built available comments field, not necessarily a field that we added. Because if you remember correctly, when I was building out that form, I didn't add a comments box. That's just part of the process. You can include comments. So that variable is actually not down here with the field variables. It's going to be up here in previous submission comment. And those are the comments that we include. And doc ID, of course, is going to be a document ID that was passed over from our earlier one. Submitter email. File name is going to be the file name. And submitter name is going to be the submitter name. Or just name. Publish and OK. All right, so if you found this interesting and you want to learn more about Laserfiche and how you can make it better utilize it in your organization, check out Laserfiche Answers. That's our Laserfiche community. Anytime people have questions they want to post to the larger group of Laserfiche users out in the public, and then also in consultants like myself, that's a good place to do it. 99% of the time, if you Google a Laserfiche question, one of the top things that pops up is posting on Laserfiche Answers. I will warn you though that a lot of those guys are programmers and they've got some very very comprehensive, great ways to get around shortcomings in Laserfiche, but sometimes it's even a little bit over my head. You can also go to the Solution Exchange or laserfiche.com/support. Although I will say my favorite resources are the ones right here at CDI. We've got a great consulting team. If you have questions about a workflow that's not working or a forms process that you think you got it, but you have a few questions, reach out to us, consulting@cdsdigital.com, and we'll have somebody get in contact with you. If you're curious about how you can get things like the Forms portal, or you want to explore looking at Import Agent or some of the other add-ons, you can talk to our sales group at sales@cdsdigital.com. And if things were working once and now they're not working, or you have a basic support question, support@cdsdigital.com. What's also kind of nice about CDI is if you send any of your questions to the wrong one of these, it always ends up in the right place. We're very collaborative, and we all work with one another to get you over the finish line. With that, I hope you found this helpful. Sorry, I went a little long. I'm sorry, I went a little fast. Again, this will be available on our YouTube channel, hopefully by early next week. And thanks for joining. I'll answer any questions you have now. All right. Let's pop this open. Would it be easier to copy the form? Probably, yeah. If you're using all of the fields and then you want to add additional ones, always copy. What's nice about the copy is it takes all of those fields that were in the variables column that I was just dragging and dropping. It brings them all over exactly the way they are already. So yes, it is easier, but it's up to you if you're going to need them all or not. I really only needed 2, and then to add another one, that's why I did it my way. Also, I'm I'm still salty that it took me so long to figure out that variables column was there when I first started. I need those scripts. Yeah, Thomas, absolutely. Reach out to our team. I worked on and added a few additional. I think the old ones had CSS, some JavaScript, and some HTML, and I added some SQL queries in there also, just because I found them helpful. I'm passing all that information off. So there's a new one available. I'm going to send that out to the individuals that monitor our consulting at citiesdigital.com email box, and they'll be able to get that out to you. Is it more efficient to use find entry or search repository when looking for a specific entry? It seems the find entry is easier to configure. Great question. I don't normally like using the find entry. I prefer the search. Yes, it's more difficult to configure, but it's much more detailed. So if you go into the Laserfiche repository and you open the advanced search and then you include the syntax, you can configure a very in-depth detailed search that's looking for only documents, not folders, containing a specific name, containing wildcards within a specific folder or subfolder, etc. It'll be able to narrow that down a lot easier, write the syntax out for you so you can copy it and then use that. The reason why I used the find entry is simply because the Laserfiche Cloud's advanced search capabilities are different and it's more difficult to use than it is on premise. So that's why I did it this way. So that's mainly for the cloud. But normally my recommendation is to always use the search repository activity when possible. All great questions. Anybody else have questions? Feedback? I'm glad you found it helpful. Yeah, the iframe, I've been using it more and more. I think it's super slick. Just remember, it's only going to work if they have access to the system. You can't share an iframe to a repository that somebody doesn't have access to. So if they're not on your network, it won't work. So make sure it's an internal process, and then you're going to be in good shape. It's a lot of fun. It's really cool. It feels good the first time it works. All right, well, if there's nothing else, I'll let you guys get back on with your day. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Know that individual meetings are available. Everybody take care, stay safe, and we'll talk to you later.